Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 847, and we will today continue Warren Goldfarb's Rule Following Revisited. And last time we went over what is a rule and how Dummett did not go the whole way to undermine both the idea or the picture of there being a sort of understanding in advance where the rule is taking oneself. You can stop here actually, it's a good. And Wittgenstein may be trying to point this out by reminding us that there is no particular fact to me that amounts to my knowing that 1002 is to be written after 1000. So there's no transcendental rule anywhere telling us in advance what will happen next. And there is also a mentioning how we go astray, and I think that's important. The ability to explain and, so to speak, ponder about the things that you have done or will be doing is also a part of practice. Not even that is something otherworldly. In page 81, there was a very interesting quote. This is also where we ended. And this is in the connection when Dummett thinks that, yes, once I have exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock and my spade is turned. But the supplement here, the addition to Goldfarb makes it even clearer. But the understandings that tell us when we have reached bedrock, when there's no further explanation we should give, and when that is accepted, are also part of these practices. So the above level is also a practice. It is no act of insight, intuition, which makes us use the rule as we do at the particular point of the series. And this is very important importantly put and important to understand. This is from the Brown Book. To call it an act of decision is less confusing. You do something when you follow the rule. It is not otherworldly, and it's not in your intuition that you intuitive, maybe that is the next step. That's going the wrong way about it. It's not an insideness. Not in the way that, oh, I have such a good idea where to go next. That is missing the point. And leads us astray into a troublesome misunderstanding. And added here, to call it an act of decision can also lead us astray. And I think this is very telling. It's an extremely thin line between getting it in the way with the three voices, the interlocutor, the commenter, the questioner. Almost impossible. But if you're aware of it, you'll be more careful. Nothing like an act of decision must take place, but possibly just an act of writing or speaking. And the mistake which we hear, and in 1,000 similar cases, are inclined to make is labeled by the word to make, as we have used it in the sentence, it is no act of insight which makes us use the rule as we do. Because there is an idea that something must make us do what we do. And I continue my read. That is a cruder way of putting it. It lacks the kind of elegance and gnarled depth of his formulations in philosophical investigations. But it gives us the right point. It is the idea that something must make us, that there is a decisive determinant that must be challenged. the bottom line is that grasping a rule is grasping a rule. There's no further general story. It is exhibited in our shared standards of correctness, in what we call obeying a rule or not. But there's nothing from which our practices flow. Practices and usages must be granted. They are not eliminable through the notion of rule following. The error lies in thinking that you can get a notion of following a rule while prescinding from those practices. Following directly on the heels of this response to the paradox in paragraph 201, Wittgenstein seems to draw a dramatic conclusion. In paragraph 202, he says, and hence also obeying a rule is a practice. And to think one is obeying a rule is not to obey a rule. Hence, it is not possible to obey a rule privately. Otherwise, thinking one was obeying a rule would be the same thing as obeying it. This has the appearance of a nearly deductive argument. But what is meant by privately? After all, in an ordinary sense, I do obey a lot of rules privately. One need not to possess a very lurid imagination to conceive of this. Clearly, this ordinary notion cannot be the sense of privacy that Wittgenstein means. Now, the way in Wittgenstein uses privacy later, starting at paragraph 243, concerns mental life. He speaks of immediate private sensations. There's no evidence that that notion of privacy is operative in paragraph 202. I take it that Wittgenstein wants to keep to the level of something that one has by oneself, that could furnish the grounds for fixity and determinateness that were being sought. It is thus a reaction to the paradox of paragraph 201. And privately here might amount to reacting. When called to explain why I am acting as I am by saying I am just doing it my way, in the way based on me. I have a principle, but it is only for me, for my use. There's nothing more I can say to explain why it is that this is following the rule. Now, put in that way that I cannot explain. I think that's important. Now I put in that way that I cannot explain. It does seem to be blatantly incoherent. It simply is not following a rule. If that's all you have to say about it. What is fueling the point in paragraph 202 has to do with what I have called the constitution of correctness. One is led to talk of private rules because one thinks that they can do this constitution. The conclusion that it does not make sense to speak of private rules is based on the idea that this constituting rule is what one wanted the rule to play philosophically. But once you say that the space of reasons is private, the rule cannot play that role. The notion of private rules as doing the metaphysical work of establishing a standard of correctness does not make sense. And that opens the way to saying that it makes perfect sense to speak in an ordinary way of obeying rules privately. Wittgenstein's concern is with private rules as doing the kind of constitutive work that the metaphysical demand places upon them. That is why the notion of private rules come up in the context of the discussion of what determines the correct application of a rule. The incoherence arises from the impossibility of distinguishing from within the correct continuation from any continuation that you wind up making. But this incoherence does not rest on any verificationist premise. It rather has to do with the notion of what a private rule is to be used for, as at paragraph 202. Something like an ultimate explanation excuse me, of our practices. If that is the way that it is used, then the private rule cannot do the job. It cannot serve as the basis upon which all else rests. The private rule cannot provide a yardstick beyond the empty assertion that I will do what I do. can leave it down. The last bit of the paragraphs or these pages, you can just leave it. It's okay, you don't have to change now, but less work. So to speak, Wittgenstein is reminding his implicit interlocutor of what his aim was supposed to have been. Note that Wittgenstein is not first showing that rule following is essentially social and then deducing that private rule following is impossible. In paragraphs 198 and 202, there's an increasing drumbeat.
Drumbeat.
Obeying rules is a custom, a usage, an institution, a practice. Of course, obeying any particular rule is a practice, a use, and sometimes a custom. But naturally, Wittgenstein means more.
More.
At its most general, rule following makes sense only given our practices, customs, institutions. I hope I have given some sense to what Wittgenstein is denying here. The way in which we have the constitution of correctness, which does not come from anything like meaning the rule or an interpretation of the rule. But the role of practices is easy to misstate and is often misstated.
Miss.
First, though, let me interject a thought. A thought. By uses, customs, and so on, I think we do not want to include only our judgments as to what is in accord with the rule in question and what is not. Many commentators take customs and practices to be thin, to be just our various acceptances as correct and rejections as incorrect of the different ways of going on.
Oh,
This does not seem to me to do justice to the words custom and institution, which suggests that more is at issue than the simple applications or goings on with the rule or our acceptance of certain steps as being in accordance with the rule.
rule.
I would also suggest that such an oversimplification of practices is connected with the anti-realist conclusion about rules. For if the practices are just limited, say to giving sums, then they look too thin and weak to provide much of anything toward the correctness of going in one way rather than another. Then it would seem as though we are unfettered. There are no facts, so we must decide. Wittgenstein is, I believe, talking about all the background, all of how we deal with rules as being part of the institutions, customs, and practices For
For
example, this
example, this
includes
includes
the
the
practice of
practice of
when we
when we
think,
think,
you
you
must
must
justify
justify
going on
going
in
on
one
in
way
one way
rather
rather
than
than
another,
another,
or what
or
sort
what
of
sort of
explanation
explanations
will
will
satisfy us,
satisfy us,
and what
and what
sorts
sorts
do not.
do not.
We can go up
We
a
can
bit.
go up a bit.
Wittgenstein is
Wittgenstein
saying
is
that
saying that
rule
rule
following makes
following makes
sense
sense
only given
only
our
given our
practices
practices
and
and
customs.
customs.
In
In
paragraphs
paragraphs
199
199
to
to
200,
200,
we are
we are
directed
directed
toward
toward
thinking
thinking
of
of
how little
how little
sense
sense
we would be
we
able
would be able
to
to
make
make
of
of
obeying
obeying
rules
rules
without
without
adverting
adverting
to
practices.
practices.
to practices. Adverting to practices.
Our practices, customs, and
Customs and
institutions
institutions
provide the
provide the
context
context
within
within
which
which
we
we
can
can
talk
talk
of a
of
step being in
being in
accord
accord
or in
or in
conflict
conflict
with
with
the
the
rule.
rule.
Or in conflict with a rule.
Now,
Now
Wittgenstein's
Wittgenstein's
quarry
quarry
is
is
something
something
like
like
the
the
unconditioned
unconditioned
grounding
grounding
of
of
rule
rule
following.
following.
Rule following.
The standard of
Standard of
correctness
correctness
being
being
constituted
constituted
in
in
an
an
unconditioned
unconditioned
way.
way.
Unconditioned way.
The
The
subtle
subtle
thing
thing
is
is
to
to
appreciate
appreciate
how
how
Wittgenstein
Wittgenstein
wants to
wants to
get
get
rid of
rid of
this
this
without
without
putting
putting
anything
anything
in
in
its
its place.
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 It is not the correctness or
Or
determination
determination
by the
by the
rule
rule
is
is
constituted
constituted
by
by
our
our practices.
practices.
Our practices. Lappapalupa lampu.
Sometimes
Sometimes
one
one
finds
finds
descriptions
descriptions
of
of
Wittgenstein's
Wittgenstein's
reliance
reliance
on our
on our
practices
practices
that
that
seem to
seem to
do
do
just
just
this.
this.
Just this.
Instead of
Instead of
attacking
attacking
the
the
role
role
of
of
determination,
determination,
they
they
put
put
institutions,
institutions,
practices
practices
in
in
that
that
role.
role.
And that rolls.
It is
It is
not
not
the
the
meaning
meaning
of the
of the
rule
rule
in
in
abstraction
abstraction
from
from us
us and
and
our
our
practice.
practices.
It is the practices that do that.
It is the practices that do that.
We
We
saw
saw
that
that
the
the
radical
radical
conventionalist
conventionalist
sees
sees
that
that
nothing
nothing
provides
provides
the
the
grounding
grounding
for
for
following
following
rules,
rules,
and
and
so
so
puts
puts
in
in
decision
decision
the
the
communitarian
communitarian
now
now
sees
sees
that
that
nothing
nothing
in
in
abstraction
abstraction
from our
from our
practices
practices
fills the
fills the
bill,
bill,
and
and
so
so
puts
puts
in
in
community.
Community.
Indeed, it is
It is
hard to
hard to
avoid
avoid,
Hard.
hard
hard
to
to
get
get
rid
rid
of
of
the
the
idea
idea
that
that
something
something
must
must
make
make
us do
us do
what we
what we
do.
do.
In
In
the
the
words
words
cited
cited
above
above
from the
from the
Brown
Brown
Book,
Book,
Brown.
it can look as we are doing is it can look as if what we are doing is to say that since we have no notion of determination of the sort that the interlocutor imagined, it must be the community. The community winds up playing the grounding role. The communitarians is a subtler mistake, but it is a mistake nonetheless. The difficulty in avoiding falling into this can be seen, for example, in Norman Malcolm's account of rule following, when he says what fixes the meaning of a rule is our customary way of applying the rule in particular cases. Many of the remarks in the investigations in the stretch paragraphs 204 and 242 are meant to indicate that we are not to put the community where the grounding of rules was supposed to be, but rather to jettison the idea of the grounding rule following, and to get us to see that in the talk of practices, institutions, and so on, there's no constituting a standard of correctness in the sense in which the interlocutor wanted one. Particularly important among the institutions, customs, and practices are our ways of justifying ourselves when we go on in a certain way, how we explain ourselves. Earlier in the investigations, Wittgenstein begins to expose and attack a philosophical picture of unconditioned justification. This figures most prominently in sections around paragraph 80 in connection with the notion of meaning. In our sections in the early 200s, this picture of justification is being put in contact with what the interlocutor wants by way of constitution of correctness. When we consider justifying how we go on in accordance with the rule. Wittgenstein is here eliciting the idea that what we are truly bound to do in following the rule is that for which there would be a full and ultimate justification of its being in the correct continuation. In paragraphs 204 and going all the way to 242, Wittgenstein calls our attention to actual practices of justification and explanation. He points out that these function in a certain ways in our lives. In order to elicit a recognition that there's a gap between the ordinary ways we justify our claims and a philosophical picture of justification that we tend to fall into. This is the picture of a complete story that would serve in all possible circumstances, and that rules out all counter possibilities, all alternative ways of going on. When we actually offer garden variety explanations or justifications in a particular context, we are just taking one clause from this full story, the one relevant to the particular case. Wittgenstein wants to undermine this picture of justification. Although to most philosophers, this is just what justification has to be. To Wittgenstein, this conception of justification is a sort of preconception that lies deeply in back of many philosophical blind alleys. By more closely attending to our actual practices, he wants us to see how taking what we do as justifications depends on their answering only what comes up in a particular situation and then stopping. And by that word, I will also stop this read through. Last word being stopping. So let's make a walk through this. Let me just stretch myself. So we saw generally here that Wittgenstein wants to show how easy it is to fall into this trap, so to speak, because the justifications are already out there. We, so to speak, we already do them. They're already present. When I talk to someone, why did you do that? Or how do you do it? You are bound to get an answer in a logical format where it's causally structured. I began by doing this, and then I continued to doing that, because that is the logic of an explanation. If someone else is to understand what I'm talking about, it often, not always, but in some cases, it takes that very form. And confusing that form with what is taking place, therein lies the problem. We can go back to some quotes, go all the way to page 81. And the penultimate paragraph has some interesting leads here. The bottom line, we'll go a bit up there, perfect. The bottom line is that grasping a rule is grasping a rule. There is no further general story. It is exhibited in our standards of correctness in what we call obeying a rule or not. So we already have this understanding, well, let's call it habitually, bodily, in our, to quote Rolf Pfeiffer, I read him a bit yesterday, all understanding lies in the movement, in how we move, how we act, how we decide, and how we learn things. All of it is a gigantic learning process. And we are interwoven in that in ways that we've forgotten how ingrained they are. And here comes a little hint of what happens next in the following pages. The error lies in thinking that you can get a notion of following a rule while prescinding from those practices. And here comes to the tricky one, and you will see this in the site here from paragraph 202 of PI. And hence, also obeying a rule is a practice. And to think one is obeying a rule is not to obey a rule. And my God, isn't that a tricky one, to say the least? And this is my job here, trying to explicate that very tricky thing. And what a little hint you can get here, what he means is that you cannot follow the rule privately if by think in this circumstance means privately thinking. Not how we usually use the word think, but as a sort of private language think. For instance, let us imagine I am Kripke
And that I'm trying inwardly to fixate with my mind the rule for, there is a Xerox machine here, the rule for working the Xerox machine. Then I will be in error. But if I say to someone, I will do it, and I instruct them, that is okay. I could even make a sort of instruction manual. All of those things are pretty okay. I would say almost to the extent that I'm repeating loud to someone else what I'm doing while I'm handling the Xerox machine. When does it get problematic? Well, it is when you go all philosophical about it. When you think, I, in my head, have a rule that is not connected to the outside doings. In that moment, the problem starts. And we can see this on the next page, so you can get an even stronger sense of it. But what is meant by privately? And listen now, after all, in an ordinary sense, I do obey a lot of rules privately. And one need not possess a very lurid imagination to conceive of this. So we can have privacy and private doing, so to speak, but it is when it goes to the next level and no longer participating in the surrounding world with everyone else, with my colleague, with the working place I'm in, with the history that's been going on before, all those things and gazillion others. If we go down to the third paragraph here, and if we go to the third line there, the conclusion that it does not make sense to speak of private rules is based on the idea that this constituting role is what one wanted the rule to play philosophically. There we have it, philosophically. But once you say that the space of reason is private, the rule cannot play that role. So once more, we have the private language argument playing in here. And you can get a little hint there. I will not make this summary too long. But if we go to the last paragraph, we have another hint here for this most difficult thing. The incoherence arises from the impossibility of distinguishing from within, somewhere within, the correct continuation from any continuation that you wind up making. And here is the difference. It is extremely subtle. It is this thin. It is paper thin. And you will get some help here in the next page. It's in the paragraphs 198 to 202. And in these, there's an increasing drumbeat. Obeying rules is a custom, a usage, an institution, a practice. These words come in and about to help us, but we also need to stay clear of overusing them and ending up in conventionalism as of Dummett, that they are only conventions. They don't have this rule about them in the doings. That is called conventionalism, and that is the ideology of Dummett, for instance. And the reason for some of the conclusions of Dummett are decidedly wrong. We can see if we go further down to the second paragraph here, and about 6 lines on the bottom of that paragraph. Then it will seem as though we are unfettered, that there are no facts, so we must decide. That is very good, and we end up in conventionalism or postmodernism. Wittgenstein is, I believe, talking about all the background, all of how we deal with rules as being part of the institutions, customs, and practices. It is so much more than just a habit or just something that one would call social interaction. It is much beyond that. And the reason for Wittgenstein using these words as custom, usage, and an institution is because he wants to help us to leave one position and go to another position, but not go too far. We should not strand in postmodernism. It is like Terry Mock's Tarlov, all the great stuff is in between. So start to go in that direction, but stop before you go too far, like Dummett and Kripke. And as I said before, it's not grounded. Our things are truths, but they are at the same time not definitely groundless. And my point here's my contribution. Because to say that something is groundless is implying a rule as well. That would be a rule. And the postmodernist, what does he do? Well, he institutes a rule that everything is relative, but at the same time forgetting that is a rule as well. It's a metaphysical claim. So postmodernism doesn't take us away from metaphysical thought. It doesn't relieve us from transcendental thinking. No, we get even worse into the transcendental Tegmarkian view. And if you may, Kalle, could we go to the next page, 84? So in social relativism, many theories of sociology today end up in this place. Listen now, third line. The community winds up playing the grounding role. The communitarians is a subtler mistake, but it is a mistake nonetheless. Remember all those people who say truth is a social construct, and even that science is a sort of a construction by people in general, or the mode of the time. That is also a mistake. The difficulty in avoiding falling into this can be seen, for example, in Norman Malcolm's account of rule following, when he says, what fixes the meaning of a rule is our customary way of applying the rule in particular cases. And now Kalle has been tortured quite long enough. Please enter.
On the very same page, 84, you read, the community winds up playing the grounding role. Let me compare with Rovelli's relational quantum physics. Rovelli would say that, as the word implies, relational is about relationships, and there are no facts hanging in there, as also Wittgenstein would say, but you need the observer. In quantum physics, according to Rovelli, this metaphor is his. Quantum physics is not a dance for two, but for three.
Yeah.
That is, the third person, that is the observer, checks if the two electrons, for instance, are both, let's say, red. If one is red, the other has to be a red, but you need a third person. So you need three dancers, so to say. And so it's communitarian in one sense, but it's still. So Rovelli would agree with this only to a certain degree. Community plays a role. Okay, if you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, to a certain degree. Yeah, definitely. It's in between.
Let me take up something completely different. I think it might actually help us.
Yeah, sure.
Understanding.
Go ahead.
It seems actually take up the doctrine of justification. And for those who don't have background theology, in Christian theology, justification is the event or process by which sinners are made or declared to be righteous in the sight of God. Let me go to the Catholic doctrine. In Catholic doctrine, righteousness is infused. That is, God pours grace into one's soul, or fills one with his grace more and more over time. Faith, as is shown through charity and good works, justifies sinners.
Good works, which is a sort of doing. I get what you mean, Kalle. Bravo!
In Protestant doctrine, righteousness is imputed.
Yeah. Inside.
Yes, to the inherently ungodly by grace through faith in the cross of Christ. Something else is also important for Protestants is that you are already declared just.
It's
At the
an a
very act
priori
of
rule.
yes, indeed, that is what I wanted to come. So to say, at your baptism. So at your baptism, you were already declared righteous. So actually, it's a very good point. That is what these things have in common. So Protestantism is actually has implied it's already you have there already a priori rule established from the very beginning.
Like a big bang.
Yes,
And then you have the classical laws, and the law says that you are already
declared.
declared.
Whatever implied, you can do whatever you want, more or less. Okay, I'm certain that Luther would be able to convince me of the opposite. But basically, it's still that you are declared righteous at the very moment of your baptism in Lutherdom, the tradition. So this is Wittgenstein's philosophy is in accord with Catholic doctrine.
Yeah,
This is why you're
it's
doing.
much closer to that. Because you need to do things, you need to do helpful, good things, and be active in society. And if you already declared to be free of sin, almost, could you say that?
Yes, because you're already a righteous at your
Yeah,
baptism. So we could say that Protestantism has two faults when it comes to doctrine of justification. One is that you already declare righteous at your baptism, so to say. That is a priori
yeah,
thing, a mistake. Two is there is no acting implied.
no, not anymore.
Uh,
And it goes for a lot of sub varieties of Protestantism, I can imagine, because I remember this too, also from the so-called apostolic church that we had in the neighborhood. It's a bit like that. It was not, they didn't participate much in the community at all. They were not very helpful for obvious reasons, because there was no saying that we are participating in the community or with other people at all. You can be for yourself, private religion, I would call it almost. It's an excellent comparison color. Very good. What was it called? Justification.
Doctrine of justification.
And it it fits rather well time-wise also, because when the Reformation came about, when we had Calvin and all those, it's about the time when we start to change our thinking, going to the left hemisphere. It's Renaissance is the last bit where there actually is a struggle from the right hemisphere, but it later takes over. And we know what happened with René Descartes and, of course, Isaac Newton, and then we were all on the left side.
So,
Yeah.
no, that I shouldn't be unfair. There are also Protestant traditions that also emphasize
Of
acting.
course.
Of course, of
If
course.
you wanted to make a comparison, and as
Yeah,
such, it's
yes.
very good. And if since we brought the whole thing up, you can actually bring in communism as well, or Marxism, because everything is decided from the beginning. It's called historical determinism. I'm not 100% sure of the phrase, how Karl Marx called it, but it's something like historical determinism. Everything is regulated from the beginning. And in Das Kapital, he mentioned it like 200-300 times. It's very important that all of history is pre-prepared, and that the future is completely inevitable. So they also had a sort of big bang in their thinking, and the big bang is very left hemisphere as well. It wants to find, you could say, fixed rules in a way that are absurd in the end, that Wittgenstein shouldn't do.
Let me ask you a question
Yeah, sure, go
on
ahead.
page 10. this one. Space of reasons private. So there is, as also Goldfarb points out, that there is a very thin line. Where is the line of private language and private obeying, and what is
Yeah,
not? And so,
it's extremely subtle. It's extremely subtle.
perhaps we can understand it as thinking something is okay. We can think whatever we want, but is not, as Wittgenstein would say, is not a move in the language
No,
game.
no,
Um, or Michelangelo, he can think in his imagination any
of
artwork,
course.
but if he doesn't do anything, it doesn't matter. So private language or private religion is possible. Yes, it's possible for being. I think I'm good, but I don't do anything. Then it's of no purpose.
Yeah,
It's meaningless. It's like having good intentions. You have a lot of good intentions, but it's pointless.
it's a matter of degree also, I would say. This is my take on it. And I always think fractal, and that you can increase how much your words mean and your belief, if you want to bring in religion, which is not a bad example, by actually doing the things, your thinking will become stronger. But if you stop doing things, your thinking and your belief and your sureness of yourself will diminish little by little. It is not an absolute cut like that. It is progressively going the wrong way.
Mm.
And I think that applies. I don't want to throw too much stones at Martin Luther, but in history, what happened is that it splitted off more and more and more and more. It lost all of its body, so to speak. And I think today we have like 12,000 denominations going from the Reformation. Yeah, what do you say, Kalle? Should we? I say thank you very much to Kalle Lundahl, and thank you especially much for that very good example. Well done.
Thank you.
And I thank all the listeners for tuning in. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, or whatever you are. Bye bye for now.